Imagine waking up to find your community shattered, the news spreading like wildfire, striking fear into every corner of Mobile, Alabama. On the morning of November 20, 2024, a dark shadow fell over this city. Pastor James Carter, a man revered by all who knew him, had been murdered in his own home. For years, he wasn't just the preacher at Joy Tabernacle Full Gospel Church, he was a friend, a mentor, and a guiding light, embodying compassion and hope for the countless souls who filled the church's pews each Sunday. His sermons inspired a town, his actions showed a heart deeply invested in healing and guiding his community. And now, he was gone. The brutal shock of Pastor Carter's death swept through Mobile, reaching friends, neighbors, and parishioners. It was as if the ground beneath them had been ripped away, leaving a hollow ache and a desperate need for answers. But the horror didn't end there. Alongside the loss of Pastor Carter was the news that his wife, First Lady Lorraine Carter, had also been caught in the violent storm that struck their home. Although she survived, the trauma was severe, and she was rushed to the hospital as doctors fought to save her. Meanwhile, her church family and loved ones prayed, clinging to each other for strength as they struggled to understand how such horror could invade the life of the couple they cherished. Outside the Carter home, church members and friends gathered, their faces etched with sorrow and disbelief. They leaned on one another, mourning and finding solace in the shared bond of their grief. But behind the tears and whispers, the weight of the unanswered question loomed: who could have done this, and why? The investigation began swiftly, led by Detective Marcus Lane, a seasoned officer known for his unyielding commitment to the truth and an almost uncanny attention to detail. Lane had handled countless cases in his career, yet from the moment he set foot inside the Carter home, he knew this one was different. Every trace of evidence spoke to a violent, premeditated attack. The shattered glass, the bullet holes, and the bloodstains told a story of struggle and loss. Pastor Carter had been shot at close range, the brutal aftermath leaving a chilling mark on what should have been a sanctuary of peace. As Detective Lane delved into the details, his gut told him that this tragedy went far deeper than it appeared on the surface. The Carter family, pillars of faith and goodwill, had inspired love and trust in the community for years. Why would anyone want to harm them? Rumors and speculation filled the air, but nothing could have prepared him for the twist that would soon turn this investigation on its head. The breakthrough came like a slap, stopping the entire community in its tracks. Pastor Carter's own daughter, Faith, had been implicated in the crime. Faith, who was known to be quiet and reserved, often staying on the sidelines at church events, had her own struggles, but no one in Mobile could fathom that she would ever be capable of such an act. She was remembered as shy, a young woman who kept to herself, wrestling silently with her own battles. The idea that she might be responsible for her father's death was unimaginable to those who had known her all her life. Now, Detective Lane was not only dealing with the murder of a beloved community leader but also with the revelation of a deeply fractured family. He knew this case would demand more than just evidence and analysis. It would require a dive into the heart of family dynamics, hidden tensions, and long-suppressed emotions. As he reviewed the initial evidence, Lane began to see a pattern, a story of private pain and unresolved conflicts that had festered beneath the Carter family's public image of unity and strength. The people of Mobile found themselves grappling with a chilling truth that hit uncomfortably close to home. Friends who had once shared holiday dinners with the Carter, neighbors who had heard Pastor James's comforting words, and churchgoers who had felt uplifted by Lorraine's kind spirit, all struggled to reconcile the faith they knew with the suspect now at the center of this horrifying tragedy. Conversations buzzed with fearful curiosity: what could have driven her to such an act? What dark, hidden secrets lay beneath the surface of the Carter family? As Detective Lane prepared to question Faith and those closest to her, he braced himself. This case would not only test his professional resolve but would also stretch his capacity to handle the layers of grief, anger, and disbelief radiating from all touched by this tragedy. With each step, Lane sensed that the journey ahead would uncover secrets capable of shaking even the most faithful hearts. Pastor James Carter had not just been a man of the church, he had been the beating heart of Joy Tabernacle, a place of comfort and hope for so many in Mobile. Those who sought solace found it in his words, and those who needed a helping hand found it in his actions. As he ministered to the broken, the lost, and the weary, his own strength became their lifeline, and his faith became a beacon. And yet, beneath the warmth and wisdom he offered to his congregation, there may have been a world of tension and pain hidden from public view. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this was more than a story of murder. It was a story of faith, betrayal, and the haunting depths of unresolved sorrow. And for those watching from the pews and porches, it was a reminder that even the most seemingly perfect families can carry secrets capable of tearing them apart. Under Pastor James Carter's guidance, Joy Tabernacle Full Gospel Church grew into more than a place of worship. It became a refuge, a beacon of hope for Mobile, Alabama. This was not just a church but a sanctuary, a safe haven where people from all walks of life found warmth and acceptance. Programs blossomed under his leadership, feeding the homeless, offering family counseling, supporting troubled youth, and hosting workshops on personal growth. Pastor James's mission was clear: he was there to uplift his community, not just in faith but in life. By his side was Lorraine Carter, lovingly called Mama Laney by everyone who knew her. She was the heart and soul of the church's outreach. Warm and gracious, Mama Laney was known for her boundless energy, pouring herself into every task, whether it was organizing events, overseeing church gatherings, or simply offering a shoulder to lean on. She embodied compassion, her kindness extending to everyone who stepped through the church doors. Mama Laney was the quiet force behind the scenes, the one who made everyone feel they belonged. For struggling single mothers, teens lost in the search for purpose, or the elderly seeking comfort, Mama Laney was a constant presence with a gentle smile. Her resilience and dedication were admired by all, and her unwavering support for her husband's ministry became a foundation upon which the church stood. Together, Robert and Lorraine had built a legacy of faith, generosity, and community, a bond that seemed unbreakable. The Carter home mirrored this spirit of inclusiveness. Their house, nestled in a serene neighborhood, was more than just a residence. It was a gathering place, a hub where church members and neighbors could drop by for impromptu prayer meetings, heartfelt discussions, or communal dinners. Holidays were especially significant, with Mama Laney preparing grand feasts and Pastor James leading prayers of gratitude and unity, his voice carrying both strength and tenderness. For many, the Carter represented the ideals of family, faith, and boundless generosity. They were pillars of the community, symbols of unwavering support and love. But behind this public image, not everything was as perfect as it seemed. The Carter family, like any other, had its share of struggles, many of which revolved around their only daughter, Faith. Growing up in a household defined by faith, high expectations, and relentless devotion to the community was both a blessing and a burden for her. Faith was a sensitive child, a girl who felt things deeply, carrying emotional weights invisible to those around her. As she grew, the expectations surrounding her felt heavier, almost insurmountable, and she struggled to find her place within the demanding world her parents had built. As years passed, the pressure of living up to her parents' image, of embodying the same strength, kindness, and faith they preached, became increasingly difficult. Faith was grappling with her own inner battles, and the weight of her parents' legacy only added to her struggles. Close friends and family began to notice. Although she had been raised with love and discipline, an underlying tension between Faith and her parents simmered, growing more intense with each passing year. Church members would catch glimpses of her frustration, fleeting moments when Faith would pull away from gatherings or leave events without a word. Her expressions hinted at deeper issues, a silent cry for relief from the expectations both she and the community placed upon her. For Faith, the Carter idealized image was a constant reminder of the high standards she felt compelled to meet, even as they pushed her down a path of isolation and self-doubt. People who had known her for years could see her struggle. As Detective Lane began piecing together the Carter family story, he found himself painting a portrait of a young woman torn between her desire for independence and the overwhelming weight of her parents' expectations. In conversations with church members and family friends, Lane discovered that Faith had often felt overshadowed. While Pastor James and Mama Laney devoted themselves to helping others, they may have inadvertently overlooked the toll their expectations were taking on their daughter. Faith's relationship with her parents was known to be tumultuous. Clashes over issues of independence, faith, and responsibility had left scars. Friends of the family hinted that while the Carter meant well, Faith's journey had been marked by moments of rebellion and a fierce drive to carve out her own identity, even if it meant defying her parents. The stark contrast between the Carter family's public image, a loving, united household, and the reality of their private struggles weighed heavily on Detective Lane's mind. Beneath the surface, the Carter were not immune to the complexities of love, disappointment, and misunderstanding that many families face. Yet, in their case, these issues were magnified by their status in the community. They were supposed to be paragons of virtue, symbols of resilience, and yet, like anyone else, they were vulnerable to the same emotional turmoil and familial discord. Detective Lane recognized that this case would require him to delve deeper, to look beyond the surface. The Carter tragedy was not simply about the loss of a beloved pastor, it was a story about the hidden fractures in a family held up as an ideal. As he pieced together Faith's life, he began to understand the depth of her isolation, the inner storm she had struggled to navigate, and the silent pressure that had built up over the years. The weight of unspoken expectations, the strain of living in the shadow of public scrutiny, and the desire to find her own voice had taken its toll on Faith. This was no simple investigation, it was an unraveling of a story about faith, identity, and the dark currents that can run beneath the surface of even the most outwardly strong families. As Detective Lane continued his work, he sensed that the answers he sought were not just within the evidence but hidden within the unspoken truths of the Carter family. In Mobile, Alabama, the Carter family was held up as an unbreakable fortress of faith and resilience. But as Detective Marcus Lane probed deeper into their lives, he began to see a different picture, one that hinted at cracks beneath the glossy image, flaws veiled by the warmth of Pastor James's sermons and the kindness of Lorraine's smile. This was no ordinary family, and their story would be no simple case to solve. The Carter were respected by the entire community, yet within their homes simmered private struggles, raw emotions, and buried tensions that, if left unchecked, might erupt with devastating force. To the outside world, Pastor James and First Lady Lorraine Carter embodied the spirit of unwavering faith and compassion. But to their daughter, Faith, these towering figures cast long shadows, shadows that left her feeling small and unseen, lost amid the weight of her parents' legacy. The more Lane learned about Faith, the clearer it became that her life was marked by inner turmoil, a constant fight to break free from expectations and find herself in a family that represented the community's ideals of strength and virtue. Faith had grown up with the eyes of the community always upon her, scrutinized as the child of revered figures. From the outside, her life might have seemed blessed, yet those closest to her knew it wasn't easy being a Carter. The only child of Robert and Lorraine, Faith was raised in a household where faith and duty reigned supreme. The Carter weren't just a family, they were a legacy, and Faith felt the full weight of that inheritance. Friends and family described her as sensitive, a quiet and introspective soul, qualities that stood in stark contrast to her parents' outgoing, magnetic personas. While Robert and Lorraine thrived in the public eye, Faith often shrank under the pressure, feeling an intense desire to be seen and understood for who she truly was. But in a family held up as paragons of virtue, there was little room for vulnerability. As Lane's investigation progressed, it became heartbreakingly clear that Faith's struggles were more than just familial tension, they were battles fought within her own mind. Through conversations with family friends, former counselors, and others close to her, Lane learned that Faith had long suffered from depression and anxiety, shadows that lingered beneath her outward silence. Being part of a family as respected as the Carter only made it harder for her to cope. Her attempts to seek her parents' support were met with faith and prayer, a well-meaning but ultimately insufficient response. Faith's mental health needs went largely unaddressed, and without the help she so desperately needed, she was left to face her demons alone. But Faith's inner struggles weren't the only source of pain in her life. Complicating matters further was her relationship with Elliot Brooks, her ex-boyfriend and the father of her young child. To say their relationship was turbulent would be an understatement. Friends described a history of intense arguments and clashing personalities, a bond marred by unresolved issues and emotional turmoil. Elliot, a hard-working but reserved man, longed for stability. Faith, in contrast, was fighting against an entire lifetime of unresolved pressures. Their attempts at building a life together ultimately failed, leaving behind a relationship in ruins and a shared responsibility to their child. The events of that fateful night revealed just how deeply these struggles had scarred Faith. In a chilling descent from despair to rage, she visited Elliot's home before making her way to her parents'. Witnesses later described her arrival, unannounced, her face tight with tension, her eyes carrying a look of something broken beyond repair. According to Elliot's cousin, who was present that night, Faith's words were few, the conversation brief. Then, in a move that seemed both impulsive and calculated, she pulled out a gun, aiming it directly at Elliot and firing, leaving him critically injured. Detective Lane studied the testimonies, piecing together a picture of a woman pushed to the very edge. Faith's visit to Elliot that night was not just an act of rage, it was a glimpse into the desperation and hopelessness that had been building inside her for years. It seemed as though, in that moment, she sought to release a lifetime's worth of anger and frustration. The testimonies pointed to more than just an isolated incident, they suggested a pattern of suppressed anguish that had finally found a voice in violence. For Detective Lane, these revelations painted a tragic portrait. Here was a woman who had been born into a family held up as models of strength and virtue. She was expected to mirror her parents' values, to stand as a testament to their teachings, yet behind closed doors, she had been slowly consumed by the weight of expectations, feelings of inadequacy, and mental health struggles that had gone largely unseen. Faith had become a casualty of her own family's image, and it seemed that no one, not even the people who loved her most, had seen her unraveling until it was too late. The stories shared by those who knew her, the documented struggles, the complex relationship with her parents, and her turbulent love affair with Elliot, all these pieces formed the web in which Faith had been trapped. She was caught between a need to be loved and accepted for who she was and a profound resentment for a life that had never felt like her own. Detective Lane knew that understanding Faith's descent into despair was crucial to solving this case. The real story was more than a tragic night of violence, it was about a family whose very image of unity and strength had blinded them to the struggles within. Faith's journey, her fall from the grace of family and faith, was a painful reminder that even the closest bonds can break under the strain of unspoken expectations and unresolved wounds. As he continued his investigation, Lane couldn't shake the image of Faith, a young woman isolated within her own family, a soul overshadowed by her parents' towering legacies. This was no open and shut case, it was a tragedy with roots far deeper than the community could see. Faith's decision to drag Elliot Brooks into her vendetta wasn't just an impulsive act of rage, it was rooted in years of unhealed bitterness. To her, the relationship with Elliot was another chapter in a story where she felt misunderstood, abandoned, and invisible. Detective Lane's interviews with those close to Faith painted a picture of a young woman wrestling with emotions too heavy to carry alone. Friends described her as a person burdened by the expectations of her influential parents, and despite the Carter family's status and wealth, Faith felt neglected, cast aside in favor of their public life. Several friends recalled how Faith would confide in them, voicing her frustration about her role within the family. She often felt as though her parents were more invested in the church's image than in her own well-being. Faith spoke of feeling like an accessory to her parents' ministry rather than a valued individual with her own dreams and struggles. To the world, the Carters seemed an ideal family, but to Faith, they were distant figures, preoccupied with public duties that left her feeling disconnected and undervalued. In recent years, this disconnect became more pronounced as Faith faced challenges in co-parenting and the complexities of raising her young child. With the demands of single motherhood weighing heavily on her, she looked to her parents for emotional and financial support. But as the church's obligations grew, so did the distance between Faith and her family. She felt as though her needs were being pushed aside, dismissed as less important than the demands of the church. This sense of neglect grew over time, festering and deepening, eventually hardening into resentment, a resentment that would finally erupt in an act of violence. As Detective Lane continued gathering these testimonies, he began to see that the tragedy that had struck the Carter family wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment but rather the climax of years of unspoken hurt and unresolved pain. Faith's visit to her parents' home on that fateful night wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate act, a final stand from a person who had been pushed to the edge, exhausted by years of feeling unseen, unheard, and unimportant. In Faith's mind, her confrontation with her family and with Elliot wasn't merely an outburst, it was a desperate attempt to make them listen, to force them to acknowledge the pain she had carried in silence for so long. As Lane uncovered more about her life, he realized this case wasn't simply about one night of violence. It was a tragic tale of emotional neglect and the unseen struggles that can fester in the heart of even the closest families. It was the story of a young woman driven to drastic measures by a lifetime of feeling inadequate and isolated. The night of the tragedy began to unfold piece by piece. Detective Lane meticulously traced her steps, reconstructing the events that led Faith to Elliot Brooks's doorstep. Witnesses and forensic evidence painted a grim, unsettling picture of her actions that night. According to Renee Brooks, Elliot's cousin who had been there, Faith's arrival was sudden and unnerving. She showed up in the driveway with a look that Renee described as distant and unrecognizable, as though her mind had drifted to a place far beyond the present moment. Faith approached the door with a cold determination. When Elliot answered, there was no conversation, no words of explanation or anger. Instead, she turned back to her car, retrieving a gun from the passenger seat. The silence was deafening, the tension thick in the air. In a chillingly calm manner, she approached Elliot once more. Without a word, she raised the gun and pulled the trigger, firing directly at him. Elliot's injuries were severe, and as he lay bleeding on the floor, Renee immediately called for emergency assistance. Faith, however, left the scene as swiftly as she had arrived. What made the incident even more harrowing was that Faith's two young children were still in the vehicle, witnessing the aftermath of their mother's violent act. Detective Lane learned that this wasn't a spontaneous outburst, it was a calculated sequence of actions, suggesting that Faith had already made up her mind. She had come with an intention, a grim determination to confront the people she believed had wronged her, to finally release the pain she had kept hidden. This insight into Faith's mindset weighed heavily on Lane. He couldn't help but wonder about the years of unaddressed struggles, the scars left by unmet needs, and the quiet desperation of a woman who felt she had lost control over her own life. This wasn't just a case of a family shattered by violence, it was the story of a person lost within the demands of an image and a legacy that had become her cage. Faith's life had been shaped by her parents' calling, her family's expectations, and the role she had never chosen yet was expected to fill without question. As Lane pieced together the final elements of that fateful night, he felt a pang of sorrow. Faith's journey was a heartbreaking reminder of how, even within a family, someone can feel entirely alone. Her story wasn't just about anger or violence, it was about the struggle to be heard, the silent pain of feeling overshadowed, and the tragedy that can unfold when cries for help go unanswered. This case had taken on a new depth, revealing not only a shocking crime but also the sorrowful reality of a young woman's life spiraling out of control. Faith's journey to that point wasn't a straight line, it was a path marked by isolation, mental health battles, and unmet needs that had grown into unbearable burdens. For Detective Lane, her story highlighted the darker, hidden side of family dynamics, where love can sometimes blind and expectations can sometimes wound. He knew that to understand the full scope of what had happened, he would need to delve even deeper, to uncover the final layers of a tragedy that had been brewing beneath the surface for years. After leaving Elliot's residence, Faith's path took her straight to her parents' doorstep, a place that, for most of her life, had represented love, stability, and sanctuary. To the community, the Carter home was a symbol of peace. But to Faith, it had transformed into something darker, a place of unresolved anger, a battleground of hurt. Determined and focused, she parked outside, her children still in the back seat, unaware of the storm about to unfold. Neighbors would later describe the sounds of loud voices piercing the quiet night air. Faith didn't hesitate, she approached the front door with a steely resolve, knocking with an urgency that hinted at the turmoil boiling within. Her father, James Carter, the calm, compassionate pastor revered by so many, opened the door, instantly sensing the tension radiating from his daughter. He tried to soothe her, his voice gentle, as if hoping that the warmth of his words might dissolve her anger. But he was unaware of the depth of her pain, the layers of resentment that had been buried for years, now clawing their way to the surface. A neighbor across the street reported hearing Robert's voice, calm but firm, his words a plea for understanding. Faith, however, was beyond calming. To her, his gentleness only seemed like dismissal, a refusal to truly understand the storm that had been building inside her. Each attempt he made to pacify her seemed to stoke her rage further, unleashing a torrent of emotions long suppressed. Inside the house, Lorraine Carter, known lovingly as Mama Laney, felt the shift in the air, a heavy tension seeping into every corner of her home. Alarmed, she joined her husband, witnessing firsthand the anger etched into her daughter's face. Despite Robert's efforts to calm her, it became apparent that Faith's emotions had spiraled beyond reason. Shadows moved frantically past the windows as the voices grew louder. The air was thick with fear, and in that instant, the Carter home, once a place of refuge, felt ominously transformed. In the blink of an eye, the situation spiraled into horror. Faith reached for the gun she had used earlier that night, the weapon she had already wielded in her fit of despair. She raised it, her hand steady, her expression unyielding. Her father moved quickly, understanding the gravity of the situation too late, yet determined to protect his family. A struggle ensued as he tried to disarm her, his face a mixture of heartbreak and resolve. But Faith's fury had reached its peak, and with a swift, fatal motion, she fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the neighborhood as Robert fell, mortally wounded. Lorraine, frozen in shock, barely had time to process what was happening. Driven by sheer instinct, she tried to shield herself, raising her hands in a futile attempt to protect herself from the same fate. Another shot followed, striking Lorraine. Though the bullet did not claim her life, it left a scar, one that would haunt her forever. Faith had shattered the very fabric of the family, leaving a scene of devastation that no one could have imagined. Detective Lane would later walk through that home, taking in the fragments of glass scattered across the floor, the blood stains marking the once pristine carpet, the overturned furniture that spoke of a frantic, desperate struggle. Each detail told a story, a history of hurt that had festered for far too long. This wasn't a case of a single tragic evening, it was the explosive culmination of years of emotional wounds, of pain left unaddressed. Every broken object, every bloodstain seemed to whisper of moments that had led to this, moments no one had truly seen or understood until it was too late. In the aftermath, as Detective Lane examined the remnants of that night, he saw how deliberate Faith's actions had been. Her drive from Elliot's house to her parents' home wasn't a momentary decision. It was a sequence of events carefully followed through, as if she needed them all to bear witness to her final break from the family she had felt so alienated from. The presence of her children, witnessing this painful unraveling, pointed to something more profound, a need for them to see her pain, to understand the chasm that had grown between her and the very people she was supposed to call family. Walking through the ruins of the Carter home, Detective Lane began to see beyond the shattered glass and broken lives. He sensed that the violence of that night was merely the visible peak of a much deeper tragedy, one that stretched back through years of misunderstanding, neglect, and unspoken struggles. The raw details of the crime were disturbing, yet it was the invisible scars, the psychological wounds, that weighed most heavily on him. How had a family that appeared so strong, so united, harbored so much hidden anguish? What could lead a person to feel so cornered, so desperate, that they saw no other path but one of destruction? As Lane walked through the home, he understood that solving this case would mean peeling back layers of pain and hidden tension, of uncovering the quiet moments of despair that had somehow remained unnoticed in the lives of the Carter. To the community, they were pillars of faith and strength, but in the privacy of their home, they were a family like any other, vulnerable to the same struggles, the same heartbreaks. Lane knew that he needed to delve even deeper to grasp the full picture of the Carter tragedy, for only then could he begin to understand how a family so respected and revered could become the setting for such horror. In his mind, he revisited the nights when Faith's cries for help had gone unheard, the moments when she felt dismissed, unseen. He imagined the tension building, the resentment festering, until it finally erupted in an act that would forever alter the lives of everyone involved. This was not just a crime, it was a story of hidden struggles, of the haunting power of unspoken pain, and of the darkness that can grow in the silence between loved ones. Detective Lane knew that the Carter family's story would be one that the community would struggle to comprehend, a tale of hope turned to despair, of love twisted into resentment. He was only beginning to piece together the final layers of a tragedy that went far beyond a single night of violence, a tragedy that revealed how even the closest of families can harbor shadows capable of tearing them apart. In the quiet, early hours following the tragedy, mobile police officers finally located Faith Carter. She was still in her car, her young children in the back seat, witnesses to an unimaginable night. The officers noted her appearance, exhausted, her eyes vacant, as if the weight of her actions had only just begun to settle in. As they led her away in custody, the community's image of Faith as the pastor's daughter, the quiet figure they'd seen at church gatherings, began to fracture. Within hours, the news of her arrest exploded across Mobile, sending shock waves through every corner. Those who had known her, who had smiled at her across Sunday services, now struggled to reconcile their memories with the woman accused of such a horrific act. The trial that followed became one of the most talked about events in Mobile's history, a story that captivated not just local news but drew reporters from beyond. The courthouse was filled each day, reporters, churchgoers, community members all gathered, hanging on every development. The prosecution's stance was clear from the beginning: this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, nor a spontaneous outburst. To them, it was premeditated murder. They laid out evidence to show that Faith had purposefully driven to Elliot Brooks's residence before her parents' house, tracing a path of destruction that night with clear intent. Among the evidence was a series of text messages Faith had exchanged with friends. Each message exposed layers of her anger and resentment toward her parents, with chilling hints at violent thoughts. These messages, along with the calculated path she followed, formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. For them, this was more than just a tragedy born of stress or emotional turmoil, it was a deliberate and dark decision. But the defense painted a very different picture. They brought in friends and neighbors, familiar faces who had witnessed Faith's struggles long before the night in question. Their testimonies revealed a young woman who, even as she grew up surrounded by the wealth and status of her family, felt the sting of neglect. Her resentment, it turned out, had roots that ran deep. Some recalled how she would voice her frustration, confiding that her parents seemed more invested in the church's needs than in her own. To Faith, her role often felt secondary, as if she were merely an extension of her parents' public image, expected to fit into a mold that left no room for her own desires or struggles. The defense built their case around Faith's mental health battles. Years of depression and anxiety had eroded her resilience, they argued, conditions worsened by her turbulent breakup with Elliot. Expert witnesses took the stand, describing her mental state as one of overwhelming despair and isolation, a woman who felt invisible, whose cries for help had gone unanswered. They argued that had her mental health needs been met, had she received the support she desperately needed, this tragedy might never have happened. Detective Lane, called to testify, brought additional complexity to the story. He recounted his interviews and observations, each one pulling back layers of the Carter family's private life. He painted a picture of a family that, beneath its dignified surface, grappled with strain and unresolved tension. Faith, in particular, seemed burdened by the belief that her parents prioritized their ministry over her needs. Lane's testimony added weight to the defense's portrayal of Faith as a young woman who had felt isolated within her own family, drowning in unmet expectations. Perhaps the most powerful piece of evidence was a series of text messages retrieved from Faith's phone. In these messages, she poured out her frustration, expressing a growing sense of helplessness and hinting at a dark solution to her problems. The prosecution held up these messages as proof of her intent, claiming they revealed a premeditated plan. Yet, the defense countered, arguing that these were not plans for murder, but cries for help, a desperate outreach from someone who felt abandoned and unseen. The text messages quickly became the focal point of the trial, each side grappling to shape their meaning. As the trial stretched on, the courtroom seemed transformed into an emotional battleground. Friends, family members, and even members of the congregation watched each day, wrestling with a mixture of disbelief, sadness, and unanswered questions. Every new piece of evidence, every tearful testimony, seemed to peel back another layer of the Carter family's complex story. It became clear to everyone in that room that this was not just about one night of violence, but about the unseen forces that had built up over years, only to erupt with devastating consequences. For the community, the revelations brought forth at trial were staggering. They saw a side of the Carter family they'd never imagined. The compassionate pastor, the devoted First Lady, and their troubled daughter, each were part of a story that held more shadows than anyone could have guessed. As witnesses recalled moments of Faith's past, her resentment, her struggles, it became clear that what they were seeing wasn't just a tragic crime, but a warning about the cost of silence, the price of not addressing pain that lies hidden. The defense pressed on, determined to show that Faith's actions, however horrific, were the result of untreated emotional wounds and neglected cries for support. Their case was rooted in the notion that society and family had failed her, that her deteriorating mental health had been overlooked in favor of upholding a pristine image. Expert after expert detailed how depression and isolation could push a person to a breaking point, each testimony adding another layer to the tragedy of a young woman who had felt cornered, left with nowhere to turn. Detective Lane's insights into the family's dynamics provided the final push in the defense's narrative. As he recounted his findings, Lane's testimony became a window into the Carter family's private struggles. It seemed impossible that a family so outwardly united could harbor such deep-rooted divisions, but Lane's words painted a chilling picture. To the community, these revelations were a painful reminder that even the strongest families are not immune to hidden turmoil, that sometimes, beneath the surface of calm, lie fractures waiting to break. With each day of the trial, the tragedy became harder to comprehend. It was not merely about the Carter family or the night of violence, it was about the weight of expectations, the need for support, and the silent pain that can grow unchecked until it becomes unbearable. As the trial moved forward, the people of Mobile found themselves not just watching a legal battle, but grappling with a cautionary tale about the importance of empathy, understanding, and the need to listen to those who feel unseen. And in the quiet moments between testimonies, one thought lingered in everyone's mind: could this tragedy have been prevented? As the trial progressed, it became painfully clear that the community was divided down an invisible line. Some looked at Faith and saw a victim, a young woman with a troubled past, crying out for help in ways no one had heard. They viewed her descent as the tragic result of neglect and untreated mental illness, leading her down a dark path that might have been avoided had she received support. But others saw something else, a woman who had allowed her deep resentment to transform into deadly intentions, calculating her actions with a mind set on revenge. The public discussions spilled out of the courtroom, pouring into coffee shops, church gatherings, and community halls. Mobile, Alabama, was a city not only mourning but now questioning the importance of mental health awareness and the hidden tensions that can silently erode even the closest families. The jury sat silent, absorbing every piece of evidence, each conflicting testimony and emotional appeal. The prosecution painted a picture of Faith as a cold, calculating individual who had planned every move. In contrast, the defense argued for compassion, pleading that her actions were the consequence of untreated trauma and years of feeling invisible. The courtroom was a tense, emotional battleground, with both sides presenting powerful cases. For the jury, this would be no easy decision. When the trial finally drew to a close, Mobile held its collective breath. Community members, churchgoers, and reporters who had followed every twist and turn now waited for the verdict, torn between wanting justice and seeking understanding. The moment the sentence was announced, Faith Carter was to serve a long prison term. A wave of mixed emotions rippled through the room and beyond. Mobile was left grappling with the devastating reality: a once respected family, the pride of their community, was now irrevocably shattered. For the congregation at Joy Tabernacle Full Gospel Church, the grief was layered and complicated. Their beloved pastor, James Carter, was gone, a guiding light extinguished, leaving a void that would not easily be filled. Robert had been more than a preacher. He was a beacon of compassion, always there with a comforting word or a helping hand. Now, the man who had symbolized faith and resilience for so many was gone, and the very family that had embodied strength was left in ruins. Congregants gathered in sorrow, mourning not only their pastor but the unraveling of a family they had seen as a model of unity. In the weeks following, church members came together to honor Pastor James's memory, filling the church with stories of his compassion and dedication. His sermons had lifted spirits, his outreach programs had touched lives, and his unwavering kindness had left an impact on people who had never even entered the church doors. His legacy of empathy and service was deeply felt, yet the tragic circumstances surrounding his death cast a long shadow, leaving a congregation struggling to reconcile the darkness that had surfaced within the Carter family. Questions lingered in the silence of the church hall: how had this happened? How could such sorrow strike a family that had once radiated light? Amid this, First Lady Lorraine Carter faced a future defined by painful losses. Her physical wounds slowly healed, but the emotional scars were far deeper, and no doctor could mend them. She had lost her husband and her daughter in the span of one horrific night, a reality she struggled to accept. Once a vibrant presence within the church, she now withdrew from the public eye, leaning on close friends and family for support. Despite encouragement from her congregation to return, to reclaim her place within the church, it was clear that the sanctuary she had cherished now held memories too raw to face. Her place of refuge had become a place of sorrow, haunted by the reminders of a family torn apart. For Detective Marcus Lane, the case was one he couldn't easily let go. A seasoned investigator, Lane had witnessed his share of tragedies, but something about this one left a deeper mark. The Carter family had been pillars of their community, respected and beloved. Yet, as Lane reviewed the final pieces of evidence and went through his notes, he couldn't shake a haunting feeling, a sense of failure, not as an investigator but as a society that had missed the signs, overlooked the red flags. How had it come to this? He wondered if the hidden tensions, the unspoken struggles within the family, had gone ignored for too long, festering until they erupted in violence. As he reflected, Lane couldn't help but question the role of the community in this tragedy. What if someone had noticed? What if someone had seen the silent strain in Faith's eyes, the suppressed frustration she carried, the isolation that weighed on her? The story of the Carter was no longer just about one night of horror. It had become a cautionary tale for Mobile, a painful reminder of what happens when cries for help go unheard. In the aftermath, the community itself was left to reflect, and many found themselves grappling with a nagging question: could this tragedy have been prevented? Discussions began emerging across Mobile about mental health, family dynamics, and the invisible weight that can grow in silence. Community centers organized gatherings, church leaders held special services, and pastors spoke openly about the importance of seeking help. The congregation of Joy Tabernacle found itself at the center of these conversations, its members bound together not just in grief, but in a renewed commitment to listen, to reach out, and to offer support in times of quiet suffering. The legacy of Pastor James's compassion continued, but now it was tempered with the bittersweet understanding of the cost of silence. The community, inspired by his life, vowed to carry his teachings forward in a way that might prevent future tragedies. Lorraine's quiet resilience, her refusal to abandon the memory of her family, became a symbol of the strength Mobile needed to begin healing. People spoke of Robert's kindness with new reverence, seeing in his life a message that had come too late for his own family, the urgent need to look deeper, to notice when someone is struggling. In the solemn aftermath, Mobile began to learn a profound lesson from the Carter family's story. Through the whispers of grief, the community heard a call to action, a reminder that even in the strongest families, pain can linger, unnoticed and unspoken. The Carter story, painful as it was, urged everyone to look closer, to reach out, to see beyond the surface. For Mobile, the tragedy of the Carter was not just an end, but a beginning, a spark that ignited conversations, changes, and a collective promise to never let another family's pain go unnoticed. And so, with heavy hearts, the people of Mobile held on to the memory of Pastor James, hoping to turn his family's sorrow into a beacon of hope for others. The tragic events surrounding the Carter family sent ripples through Mobile, transforming their loss into a community-wide reflection on mental health and hidden family pressures. For the first time, conversations that had once been whispers were brought into the open. Pastors from across the city, counselors, and community leaders gathered to hold forums, encouraging families to speak openly about their struggles and to recognize the importance of seeking help before it's too late. Joy Tabernacle, once a symbol of strength now touched by grief, became the heart of this movement. Its members, devastated but determined, hoped to turn their sorrow into a force for positive change. Community centers responded by hosting workshops on family dynamics, creating spaces where people could discuss the unspoken challenges they faced. Workshops on mental health resources were offered, aiming to create a safety net for those struggling in silence. This case reinforced, for Detective Lane, the crucial role of early intervention in preventing tragedy. As he worked through his own reflections on the Carter case, he often thought of Pastor James, of his life spent lifting others and of the tragic irony that a man who had inspired so much healing in his community had been unable to prevent the turmoil within his own family. For Lane, this tragedy was a reminder that the signs of trouble are not always obvious, they can be quiet, subtle, slipping under the radar. He, along with many others in the community, vowed to be more vigilant, to look beyond appearances, to listen a little closer, and to notice when someone might be struggling in silence. Despite the immense sadness that hung over Mobile, Pastor James's legacy of compassion and empathy lived on, sparking a collective effort to prevent similar tragedies. His teachings on forgiveness, kindness, and support were recalled with renewed reverence, becoming a touchstone for a community eager to honor his memory by addressing its deeper needs. In the weeks that followed, Joy Tabernacle established a fund in Pastor James's name, dedicated to supporting mental health services for congregants and anyone else in the community in need. It was a small but meaningful step, a symbol of hope in the face of grief. As the community continued to mourn, they began the slow, difficult work of healing, acknowledging the blind spots that had long existed around mental health and family dynamics. They recognized that even in families as outwardly strong as the Carter, invisible wounds could fester and grow. Pastor James's impact lingered in the hearts of those he had touched, a beacon of hope that refused to dim. The story of his life, and the tragedy of his death, served as both inspiration and warning. In honoring him, the people of Mobile made a commitment to each other. They would reach out, seek connection, and protect the mental and emotional well-being of those around them. In their collective loss, they learned a powerful truth, that even the strongest seeming families can carry unseen pain, and that confronting these issues, rather than ignoring them, might be the key to preventing future heartache. As time went on, the people of Mobile began to see the Carter tragedy not just as a story of loss but as a call to action, a reminder to care for one another with renewed compassion. Through this painful experience, they learned that healing required openness, empathy, and the willingness to address what often goes unnoticed. The shadow cast by this tragedy served to illuminate a brighter path forward, a future where families could find support, where community members were vigilant and compassionate, and where no one would feel compelled to struggle in silence.